What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 104, and I am the co-host of the show, Kyle Anslone, joined by the co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today, buddy?
Doing good. How you doing, Kyle?
Doing well. A little on the tired side today, but I'll get through today, get some good sleep for tonight, and be ready to go for the week here. But we got some news to cover today, some important stuff, especially on Afghanistan. And you've been writing and covering, Will, the start of the withdrawal here, so we'll get into that. And if we are actually coming up on the end of war, this would be the start of it, although I don't think that's what's happening. So that's what we're talking about today. Make sure you share the show. We have Odyssey and YouTube for the video versions. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and then social media accounts at Facebook, Twitter, and MeWe for you to follow, like, and share the content of the show. Thank you all so much for doing that. We're getting a pretty good response on social media, and the Odyssey account is growing very quickly. So that's awesome as well. The more people we have follow us on Odyssey, we can sync it to the YouTube channel, and that will save us a little bit of time uploading all the content. So think about going to Odyssey, signing up, and then liking the show. Also giving us support. We're already a 4-star account on Odyssey, so if you donate to us, we get, that promotes the account more and helps us out. So Odyssey, YouTube, wherever you go, like and share the show. Will, we also got to thank our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is a brand new website. It looks amazing. Carlos and Vanessa had a big launch party for the website on Friday. Won myself some of the sports cream, the CBD infused sports cream, which I was super
Nice.
psyched about. Yeah, I'll say I intentionally got third place in the trivia contest just to get the product I wanted. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but I'm gonna say it. And then so I really like their topical products. Go see PalomaVerdeStore.com. Check out all their products. I like the topicals. Will, what do you recommend?
Yeah, my favorite stuff. You like the topicals. I like the. I'm not sure what the opposite of topical is, but the stuff that you take. They have like a higher dose extract, the oil extract. I really like, and especially the soft gels. They have various formulations. I think they have one with curcumin. My favorite is the one with melatonin, though, to help you kind of wind down and relax at night.
Yeah, and I think they said at the launch party, will they have a new formula with another cannabinoid, not THC, that's the psychoactive one, but another psychoactive cannabinoid
Right.
infused with that.
Nice.
So you'll have to check out that one and see what it does for you. But anyways, everybody, PalomaVerdeStore.com. Check out the new website. Check out the great products. And Will, let's get into the content. And now let you start off talking about your article here. They say the withdrawal has begun. What does that mean, and what are they looking at for a timetable here?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with what, is ostensibly good news. I mean, that's kind of a rarity on this show, but this is, seemingly good news. So Thursday night, the White House confirmed that the withdrawal from Afghanistan had begun. Like the process is now underway. And, they do still plan on taking another 4 months before this is all actually a done deal by September. That's supposed to be the actual deadline. So I would say that a full-on celebration is probably premature, but this does, I think, commit them a little bit more, one more step to making this happen. That like once you've come out and said that we've started doing this, I think that does make it a little more politically costly to go in reverse course. Now, of course, often the way this works is they'll send in more guys and more equipment before they pull any out. They say they have to have force protection to make sure everyone's apparently safe while they're packing everything up to leave. That's sort of the claim and the idea, at least. I don't think this involved a whole lot of additional troops that they sent. I think they sent in some Army Rangers, I read. They made a couple long-range bombers available, and then I think they floated a carrier strike group into like the region generally. Just kind of all that just in case, I guess.
So, Will,
I'm
can
hoping. Go ahead.
I'm just curious here. So, they say they need the extra equipment and personnel because they're concerned about strikes or something during the drawdown period. It would make sense to me say they have to, deploy some of the larger so they're pointing out, they need the extra support during the withdrawal period. But what about the fact that they blew past the May 1st withdrawal date? Wouldn't that be, more likely the cause for the Taliban to attack the U.S. is because, we're staying too long, not because we're drawing down? I find that particularly interesting, Will, just because we found out Dave DeCamp wrote about this at antiwar.com, that the Taliban actually protected the U.S., and this is from a report from Reuters, that the Taliban had protected U.S. bases from other groups in Afghanistan. Maybe this is ISIS-K. That's kind of what I guessed. And we do know that the U.S. has supported the Taliban with some drone attacks against Islamic State Khorasan group in the past. So I'm just curious if they're at all signaling in the U.S. government will that this is because they blew past the drawdown date, or if they're just trying to say that this is because this is the typical drawdown procedures.
Yeah, the latter. I think the sort of signals that I think the Biden administration is giving is that this extra force protection is just sort of a procedural thing that we would always do, and I do believe that it is a common thing to have a little bit of extra force protection when you're drawing down. However, I think you do make a good point that yeah, I mean we went back on our word. We were supposed to leave by May 1st, and the Taliban and maybe other militant groups have vowed continued strikes on American forces if they stayed past that date. So very well, it seems likely that they're probably worried that of additional attacks on U.S. forces because of the vows to do so from the Taliban and other militant groups. Because we blew past that withdrawal date. Now I'm hoping that the forces they sent in for this alleged force protection, I'm hoping those themselves won't be too visible and provocative and make it look like there's a new, like mini surge or something that could, draw some attacks between now and September. I've sort of thought about that the deployment itself could be sort of provocative and invite those kind of attacks. But so regardless, though, between now and September, there is certainly a lot of time for them for this to get screwed up. If there were one of those attacks, they could turn right around and say, "Oh, we can't leave. We have to, stay and keep fighting this thing." However, for just for now, I am sort of cautiously optimistic that like this process has begun, that it is at least underway. However, that sort of attitude, that has definitely not been the reaction of a lot of the corporate media over the last couple of weeks. They've been kind of screeching about, even the prospect of leaving since Trump mentioned it, and especially since he signed the deal with the Taliban last year to leave. There've been all kind of, complaining and screeching in media. However, really, since Biden announced this new withdrawal date by September 11th, there's been like a whole new wave of stories like this in the corporate media that are, warning of dire things happening if we leave. And so just on Friday, this is less than a day after we got this White House announcement that the withdrawal had begun, CNN had this exclusive interview with two guys claiming to be members of al-Qaeda and just completely hyping up their threats of, future attacks on the U.S. and U.S. forces. Yet they never even cite them by name once throughout the whole piece. These two guys, they keep totally anonymous, and they basically just take them at their word for everything that they say. Like, when they claim these, they're going to launch future attacks, and when they claim that al-Qaeda is becoming strong allies again with the Taliban, CNN just sort of takes them at their word. And they give really no reason to believe these guys are credible. They give us no reason to think that they would have like a lot of knowledge of the inner workings of al-Qaeda or of their relations with other groups. We're just supposed to sort of take these guys at their word as if it's Ayman al-Zawahiri himself making these pronouncements. And the CNN story is framed. The whole thing is framed in the context of leaving Afghanistan, of course, like very strongly implying that. Like, see, look what happens if you leave a war zone anywhere. If you ever end any of these wars, the terrorists and the evildoers all, make a comeback. Look, they even say so right here. That was sort of the tenor of the whole CNN piece. And CNN has certainly not been alone, in doing this. Here, they're basically like acting as an amplifier for al-Qaeda propaganda from these two nameless nobodies. But we've had all kinds of articles over the last couple of weeks along those same lines, not necessarily citing al-Qaeda guys, but just saying that leaving is going to be a disaster because there'll be this resurgence of terrorist attacks. The New York Times and the Washington Post have probably been among the worst about this. They've published quite a few. I lay out quite a few examples in my article, but it seems like just about every major news outlet has published stories, along these lines, suggesting that leaving is a bad idea because there'll be, terror attacks and we won't be able to maintain our counterterrorism force in the region and all this stuff. And some of these stories are sort of relaying comments from the national security state, from like the CIA director and the head of CENTCOM, as I cite in my article. And some of them are just the journalists themselves making these arguments. Which is funny to see, the CIA director and journalists sort of on the same side, having the same interests, making the same arguments. So I think definitely between now and September, we can expect a lot more articles like this. That these people in media are going to do their very best to make sure that this either that this withdrawal doesn't happen, or that it's going to be as painful as possible. They're going to hype up every threat made by random militants, and every threat from anonymous intelligence spooks. And unfortunately, I'm not sure if Biden has the backbone really to resist that. Like, I think 4 months of this could potentially do a lot of damage, could potentially even have an effect on policy if they, keep hyping up stories like this for 4 months straight. So I guess a lot of that's going to depend on how, committed he is to doing this, whether he thinks, this is something that he has to do or that he really wants to do it. I don't know. But I am a little concerned that stories like this, the CNN piece and all these other mainstream media articles will have some effect on policy by September.
I think there's another possibility, Will, that what they're going to achieve isn't maybe even stopping the withdrawal, but increasing the U.S. air war in Afghanistan or some kind of U.S. operations, getting the war to continue in another way. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be that they end up stopping the withdrawal and Biden ends up getting U.S. troops and potentially even contractors out of Afghanistan. Although it seems like they're just going to be U.S. contractors by proxy, right? Because we're going to pay the Afghan government to pay the contractors the money to do the jobs that we are paying the contractors to do. So
Right.
is I mean, that it's actually probably a worse deal for the American people, because that means there's at least one, probably more Esther layers of skimming off the top from the Afghan government, layers of corruption and stuff like that. That they'll either hire less people and the planes will be in more disrepair, or end up costing the U.S. more. But just thinking about like how this could play out, I could see us, having our troops and even all U.S. paid contractors, certainly all American, actually U.S. Americans paid by the U.S. government to be armed
Right.
contractors in Afghanistan, out by September 11th. But then we also increased the war in different ways, either with CIA, special operations, or more drone strikes and airstrikes. I'm sure that with, if you read William Arkin's article in Newsweek about, the how advanced they've gotten and how, much they've learned about how to carry out these air wars with drone strikes and surveillance and everything like that. Not that I think they could like win the war in Afghanistan with it, but they could probably hold off the Taliban and really punish the Taliban without having a single troop in the country. So
Right.
that's something to consider. What else do you have on Afghanistan, Will?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of piggyback on something you said, like, you're right. This kind of reporting might not actually stop the withdrawal in its tracks, but I think it could, like, unfortunately, keep us involved in ways that could eventually lead back to, renewed fighting there. I mean, Biden in his first address, some people were calling it a State of the Union. I think some were disputing that was technically a actual State of the Union address. But in any case, Biden's first joint address to Congress last week, he mentioned something about wanting to keep an over-the-horizon capability for Afghanistan. And we mentioned this on a recent show, and there was a reporting in the New York Times about this, where Pentagon officials are suggesting maybe stationing U.S. forces in nearby countries, in like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Tajikistan, or these places nearby. And that might very well be what Biden is talking about with this over-the-horizon capability. And that makes it even more concerning when we're sort of keeping troops right next door to pounce. And there's all this, reporting, basically begging for re-engagement in the country. It seems like that's a bad recipe.
Right, and what did the Afghan commander Stephen Townsend say about Trump's withdrawal of troops from Somalia? They're commuting
Oh
to
yeah,
work now,
that's right.
right?
Yeah,
And so,
exactly.
how much difference is it going to make if the troops are stationed at the Bagram Air Base and flying their missions out of there versus being stationed at, I think it's the K2 base in Uzbekistan? That's the former Soviet one where all the soldiers get these crazy cancers because of like whatever's wrong with the mud that the base is built on top of. But wherever in Central Asia or in Pakistan, wherever these troops end up being stationed, even if it's like offshore on a aircraft carrier or something, they
Right.
could be
Yeah.
deployed to Afghanistan very quickly. whenever so I don't think this war is ending on September 11th, even if the troops do come out, but the media pressure is crazy and we may end up keeping the troops and contractors in. One interesting issue coming up is what to do with contractors who are maybe Afghan contractors or other people in the Afghan government who have worked
Yeah.
for the United States and won't feel secure once the United States leaves. I think it's a complicated issue and fair to say that it's more complex than we owe these people nothing, too bad when we leave that you're going to face reprisals. At the
Right.
same time, I think it's absurd, people who, kind of have the opposite attitude, which is we need to keep our troops there forever to protect those people and to make sure no harm ever comes to them. But I'm seeing, I think Dave DeCamp had this one on antiwar.com, that Afghans who work for the Pentagon fear the U.S. is going to leave them behind. I saw that the Biden administration did say they would lift the cap on refugees from the Trump number, although that was after they said they weren't going to do it. And then then there was outrage even from the progressives, and so they said they would lift the cap, but didn't say how many. So who knows how many refugees are going to come in. The U.S. is cutting its embassy staff in Kabul out of fear
Yeah.
that blew past the May 1st drawdown date. So this could be a real mess. And just to remember that this is the U.S. government planning this withdrawal, and so it wouldn't happen in a way where if you had a competent, like if President Ron Paul hired Douglas McGregor to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan and that war, I would trust that that would get done in a way where there's as little damage done to these people as possible who have worked for the U.S., maybe even commit war crimes or have been involved in nefarious activities working for the U.S., and trying to sort out like who we would let come to the U.S., who we're going to at least let, we'll try to get them out of Afghanistan, set them up in Saudi Arabia or something. I have no idea, but it's a really difficult thing, and I think the government could really screw this up, and then people are going to point their fingers and say, "Oh, look, the non-interventionists and the anti-war folks wanted this to happen." No, no, no. This is a consequence of the endless U.S. war. It would happen when the U.S. left at some point, anyways. But just because they can't do this competently doesn't mean that it's the anti-war community's fault.
Right, right. And I'll make just one last point here on Afghanistan. Like when we talk about, like I sort of, voice skepticism when CNN hypes up these about this stuff about terror attacks. And that's when I'm skeptical about that. I'm not skeptical that there will be some violence in Afghanistan after we leave. I'm not disputing that there will be, it'll be a rocky road to once we leave there. However, I am more skeptical about this idea that, oh, Afghanistan's going to turn into this terrorism incubator where like attacks on the U.S., the homeland or whatever, will be launched from there. That's sort of like, reprisal of the whole safe haven myth, which was never really true in the first place. It's all based on the idea that the 9/11 attacks were planned in Afghanistan. But I mean, the 9/11 attacks were planned in Hamburg, Germany, and in Florida and California, and in the U.S. itself. There's nothing special about Afghanistan. As Scott Horton says, it's not a magic portal from Afghanistan into Boston Logan Airport. So this idea that Afghanistan will again turn into this terrorism incubator, I find that's a much less credible idea. The idea that there will be some violence from local warlords and the Taliban and stuff after we leave, that's much more likely, I think. But I just wanted to sort of make that distinction. But if you had nothing else on Afghanistan to say, I think we
I
can move over.
actually had a couple
Oh,
other
sure.
quick stories I wanted to mention.
Great, go
The
ahead.
AP had a pretty interesting write up today on the who controls what in Afghanistan, and as the title points out, that it's kind of hard to map this murky issue now, especially since the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction no longer gives their data or doesn't calculate it at all. I'm kind of unclear on if they just don't make it public or if they don't track it anymore.
Yeah.
But it seems that the Taliban control of Afghanistan is increasing, according to this AP report, and they cite all people from fairly hawkish or mainstream sources like War on the Rots, and so I
Yeah.
tend to think that this is accurate. What they're saying here, that the Taliban are increasing their control, and this is likely to continue as the U.S. draws down this war. I've been saying for a long time that one of the things that's going to happen in Afghanistan is you essentially have something of a market correction to come, right? The U.S. has artificially propped up the Afghan government. They've controlled more territory than they would have without the U.S. support. And so once that U.S. support is gone, especially since it doesn't seem that there's going to be any official ceasefire peace deal in place, I think the Taliban are going to take control of a significant amount of Afghan territory. I'm not saying, over, they're going to control Kabul or anything like that. And who knows, hopefully that at least, everybody kind of knows when this date's coming at least. And so they could maybe facilitate, let's say, the Taliban let the Afghan army leave Lashkar, Kandahar City, Farah City, some of these capitals of heavily Pashtun areas where the Taliban in the past like 3 or 4 years have shown that they've been able to take these capital cities for a short period of time, to just let the Afghan army leave, let anybody who fears living under Taliban rule leave, and then allow the Taliban to come in from some kind of something like that. Hopefully, to at least if the Taliban does take over more of the country, it could be done as bloodlessly as possible. And then the AP did a little cost of war thing on the Afghan war, and I just want to say, I think these numbers are very conservative. I think it's, more what they could prove than what it actually is. So they, say at least about 50,000 civilians have been killed, and then it's cost over $2 trillion. And I mean, don't you think that there should be a huge reckoning for this, that 50,000 at the very minimum, 50,000 completely innocent people, civilians, not to mention the fact that a lot of the Pashtuns, the Taliban that have died in this, are no different than any American who picked up the gun with a foreign invader. These were not people who were picking up the gun in the name of Osama bin Laden and jihad. I would guess even really in the name of Allah. It was more in the name of, this is my village, this is my town. I'm going to defend my, my country, my territory, my culture, and all these people end up dying. It's a horrible thing. And yet so many of the people who got us into this war, like right now, George Bush is going on the news saying that, I don't know how we could deal with the misinformation that we have today. Matt Spoot is writing articles about how the Republican Party has honesty problems and how the Republican Party needs to be dissolved. And it's crazy that this plus the Iraq war are the worst things. I mean, Yemen may surpass that. You look at Libya and Syria and Somalia, which I'm not trying to dismiss the horrors of that, but just how long we've been there, what we've done to these cultures and societies, and how many people we've killed, that the people who are most responsible for that get to still sit there and make hundreds of thousands of dollars lecturing us is almost unbearable sometimes, Will. So I just had to make that point, but now we can move on.
No, no, all well said. Yeah, good points. But just to shift gears here, I think we had Biden's engaged on like all these different policy reviews and task force and stuff, and I believe he did one for North Korea, and I think they looked at what U.S. policy should be for 3 months, and now they've got some verdict here. So tell us what did they decide?
Well,
Uh,
it really ends up being like so many of the other stories where if you just go and scroll through the headlines, you would think that this is a huge major policy shift, that Biden is splitting the difference between Trump and Obama and taking the right path. And so like the MSN article was titled that Biden is walking a new path. So in the VOTS one and others were very similar. And so well, we've had the policy review, and I guess it's come in. The policy review was headed by Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, National Security Advisor Jake the Snake Sullivan, General Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the Staff. I'm not sure like what other lower level staffers were involved. Will, I'm sure we would recognize some of the names, knowing who's filled out the Obama or Biden administration. Questions. I wonder if like Eli Ratner was involved. I know he's big on the China policy review, which I
Right.
think would have to factor in here. But essentially, yeah, what they're saying is that they're splitting the difference between the Trump and the Obama policies, but it splits the difference in a way where they're asking the wrong question. And so they're saying that they're not going to do the strategic pages of the Obama administration. They're not saying that North Korea has to give up all their nuclear weapons in order to engage in talks and sanctions relief. And they're also saying that they're not going to do the Donald Trump thing, which is to like have a huge publicity summit and then sign a sweeping deal, saying that that's not really going to work either. Although I would somewhat disagree that that isn't possible. I think there was potential to sign a deal at Hanoi in 2019, and there was a lot of background work that went on there. Well, it wasn't just Trump and Kim Jong Un's letters. There were working groups established, and it was
Right.
John Bolton who destroyed that thing. They also just sum up the entire. I noticed a lot of Trump's entire North Korea policy has been summed up as this is what John Bolton wanted to do, which I think is in a way true. Like Bolton did ultimately take the reins and destroy any potential of Trump's North Korea policy, but that does leave out the nuance that, for a long period of time, North Korea didn't test really any missiles or any other weapons. There was, a relative period of positive diplomatic steps taken by both North South Korea and the United States. Of course, it's now gone backwards, but Will, I know you probably remember the time where like the North and the South Korean troops were like seeing each other at the border and like exchanging cigarettes and stuff like that. That did happen during the Trump administration. But they're trying to say that this is the Biden policy is splitting the difference. What they're not doing is they're not reversing the sanctions. They're not looking at revising the hostile policy, ending the Korean War, and saying that ultimately the final deal has to reach North Korean denuclearization. And
Yeah.
so it's still again asked the wrong question, which is what does the U.S. need to get out of talks with North Korea? And really, that should be to appease, or not maybe appease the South Koreans necessarily, but allow the South Koreans to engage in what diplomacy they want with the North Korean colleagues. And it doesn't seem that the Biden administration is going to let that happen, because we know from recent weeks that the South Koreans felt like that they had put a proposal on the desk of the Biden administration for an official end to the Korean War, and it doesn't seem that the Biden administration is going to pursue that policy. And so I from my perspective, this is more of the same. Well, it's I think a little bit closer to the Obama position than the Trump position, because at least with the Trump position, the idea that him and Kim Jong Un would get together, maybe something bigger could have been done. Where this seems like more strategic patience, since it's a non-starter for the North Koreans, and the North Koreans have made that clear. Despite of what the U.S. kind of propaganda has been coming out and saying, the North Koreans immediately came out and said that this is a big blunder and this is the same hostile policy. And so the most important thing is how the North Koreans react to it, and they're saying absolutely not. Another thing that
Yeah.
this report doesn't factor in at all is the relationship with China has even gone more downhill since the Trump administration, and Biden's even more hawkish on China, and in no way factors in how that's going to change the difficulties of, first of all, getting a deal done with North Korea, because China could be powerful in facilitating that. I think Trump actually found some success in working with the Chinese to crack down on smuggling to North Korea to make the sanctions more effective. I mean, not that I like more effective sanctions, but at the same time, like from their policy standpoint, it made their policy what the goal they thought it got them to the goal, closer to the goal they were trying to achieve, because of their
Right.
closer relations with China. And so they don't factor in at all that they don't have that. And so it seems like the Biden administration is just going to make a pretty big swing and a miss on North Korean policy. And I guess best case scenario, Will, is that Kim Jong Un kind of just keeps keeps his head down for a while and doesn't make too much noise to draw, the U.S. hot's attention. Because I don't think Biden will maybe look to start or increase the, even sanctions or the conflict with North Korea really, unless for some reason his administration had to pay more attention to it. I think they would be very content about leaving this thing on the back burner for 4 years, let more North Koreans suffer and starve to death under U.S. sanctions, and that be it.
Right, right. Yeah, I was happy to see at least that they are, at least giving some lip service. Like, we'd like to have some dialogue with them. I'm glad they're not full on adopting the Obama kind of policy of like, screw you, we're just not even going to talk to you. But I did think you're right. Like, they're really wrong-headed with their analysis of Trump's, approach to all this. And they're saying that, oh, his grand bargain approach is like that failed. But I don't think that did fail. I think it failed because, like you said, John Bolton, there was a period where he had less control over the negotiations. You'll remember we wrote a story, or wrote a pretty long analysis about this. But there was one of those summits in Korea where Bolton wasn't there. He was sort of sidelined. They sent him off to Mongolia or something. And like Tucker Carlson, I think, was there, like a much more like dovish kind of voice.
When Trump went to the DMZ in the summer of 2019?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it was definitely the DMZ meeting. Yeah. And so there was a period there where the negotiations were not going in Bolton's direction. They were sort of the whole grand bargain thing, if you want to call it that, was working. But it was only when they kind of like, scaled it back. And, when Bolton got the reins again in Hanoi, when they started injecting all these like maximalist demands. And that same language, as you can see, is making its way into Biden's policy, too, about the denuclearization of Korea. Now, I did see some analysis saying that like, oh, no, Biden's using this more like more diplomatic language by saying the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula instead of just North Korea. But I didn't really see much of a difference there. I think Kim Jong-un sees that as, surrender. That's what he, sees that as a demand of.
Right.
But yeah, that's about all I had on the Korean policy review. It does seem like sort of more of the same. Go ahead.
I did have one more note, and that was that the Biden administration is using the phrase that they're looking for a phased agreement, a phase, rather than using the word step by step. And this shows that this is all for American propaganda consumption, that they want this to sound to Americans. When Rachel Maddow, when Chris Hayes, when Sean Hannity talks about it, they want it to sound different to Americans, like Biden is proposing something new. But phased agreement is the exact same thing as step-by-step process. Those are synonyms, and the U.S. media is reporting it as a phased agreement. It's incredible that they would go along with this and just repeat this propaganda when it's so clear that this is for American consumption. You don't think the Korean translators translate to the same damn word in Korean? The phased agreement versus step by step, they have to hate this so much. Like, you really feel bad sometimes for even these people that I don't actually like Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, but to try to deal with the U.S. foreign policy with how off the rails it is and how public it is off the rails has to be difficult.
Right, and when so much of it is just theater, it's just meant for domestic consumption. That was the whole thing of Justin Raimondo's foreign policy, libertarian realism in foreign policy, was that so many of these policies are meant for domestic consumption. You have to see it through that prism.
Right. That's all I have on North Korea.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I guess just to shift gears a little bit, there was this recently. There was the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, put out a report on Venezuela. I believe they touched on sort of some of the humanitarian situation there, and I think they get into sanctions a little bit. But I know you had something on that, so tell us about this USAID report.
Yeah, so it was the watchdog for USAID put out a report on the February 19 theatrical event on the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Well, we covered this on Foreign Policy Focus at the time. This was what was the name of the concert? Aid to Venezuela, or Venezuela Aid, put on by billionaire Richard Branson. They lined up tons of this aid that they were going to bring in to Venezuela, and famously on this bridge that's never been used before, the aid was stopped by a Venezuelan blockade. Now, the way it's portrayed in this article is incorrect. They kind of say that the Venezuelan government violently blocked the security forces, and then mention that one of the trucks caught fire, failing to mention that it was from the opposition, that the Molotov cocktail was drone that set the aid truck on fire. So that
Yeah.
that seems like a pretty important detail to leave out. But the important thing is what that this report actually points out, and it finds that this was a theatrical event. Now that's not the actual, the reports don't find those, but if you read the report, if you look at what's the quotes from the report, that's what you'll see. One of the first things they point out is that Venezuela really didn't need the aid that they were bringing in. They were trying to bring in meals for children that were at some phase of malnutrition that not many Venezuelan children were. And so one of the most disturbing things about this report, Will, is me and you definitely know that there are children in this world, especially when you look at sub-Saharan Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, specifically Yemen, that could actually really use a whole bunch of aid for malnourished children. And even if it was too complicated to send that to Yemen or Somalia, like South Sudan could have used it. There's a lot of countries that really could have used this aid, and so rather than bring it there, they brought it to Venezuela, where they weren't sure it's actually even needed. But then they found that they brought it in on the Air Force, I believe they're C-17 cargo planes, when there
Yeah.
was much cheaper ways to transport it. They also found that that this whole event cost about $2 million, and then 34,000 of that aid was actually destroyed trying to bring it into the country, and it's all just it was for theater. There were other ways to help the Venezuelan people. It said that actually some of the aid that the Venezuelans needed, the U.S. just distributed the normal way through the UN Red Cross programs, and it got
Right.
to the Venezuelan people and helped people. And so it's so important to remember that while we talk about values and the hot say that we need to do these things to save people, it's not about that. The sanctions aren't about helping people, and the aid isn't either. And I think this story is important because Samantha Power just got confirmed as head of USAID, and so I think we could see other things like this coming from the
Yeah.
the new USAID, where they organize these kind of stunts. And so when you see like what if maybe Ukraine, well, Zelensky lines up a bunch of trucks on the border of Crimea or the Donbass, and he says, I'm coming in with these trucks because people need aid. They probably don't need the aid, but it's going to be a great way to provoke a conflict, or to have that aid stopped by, the Russian or the, Donbass forces, and, told to turn around. Then they're going to say, oh my God, they're trying to starve their own people to death. Look how horrible they are. So
Right.
this is kind of stuff that happens all the time. And again, to tie that to Yemen, Will, we're forcing aid on countries that don't want it or necessarily need not all of what we're providing. It's also
Right.
important to think about that the U.S. sanctions probably caused the need for a lot of that aid in Venezuela as well, as long as
Yeah.
the rest of the U.S. hostile policy, because we make it very difficult for any country to do business with Venezuela. In Venezuela, like, has power plants that use different parts and generators from Western. You just can't replace that overnight. You know what I mean? Like, if
Right.
Siemens makes your products for your power plant, like, and then you get sanctioned and Siemens won't sell it to you, like, you just can't go to Russia and be like, hey, do you have like the commie part that plugs in here? They don't. That's
Right.
they're not commies anymore, but that, just to point that out too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we've had, like, in the last, all right, not in the last couple of months, in the last couple of years, I should say, we've had a few different reports. Recently, we had one from the UN Special Reporter on Human Rights, I think, about the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, and she said that the U.S. sanctions are driving humanitarian calamities there in so many different ways. She listed all these different, like you even mentioned, some of the replacement parts for some of the infrastructure and stuff. It's just making modern civilized life very difficult in a lot of parts of Venezuela. And then a couple of years ago, I think it was 2017, we had this report from the Center on Economic Policy Research, which found that U.S. sanctions may have contributed up to 40,000 excess, additional deaths in Venezuela, just from all kinds of malnutrition and lack of access to medical care and all this stuff. And I don't know if that number is accurate, but that was sort of the upper end estimate of the 40,000. But we are talking about some severe, some real impact that our sanctions are having. So it's interesting that, even when we are creating these real humanitarian needs, we then stage these fake, PR stunt humanitarian, shipments just for the sake to sort of advance this regime change narrative that, like, look how bad the evil dictator is. That was sort of the whole point. And just to be clear, the USAID report, this is talking about something that happened under Donald Trump, correct?
Yes, this was in February 2019, and the
Okay, yeah,
report did come out in April 16th. So, if you're
yeah.
wondering why this got released, that might be a part of it. Was
Sure.
some people had an ad story. I also think it was released before Samantha Power got confirmed, which I thought
Right.
was maybe an interesting thing. Like they try to push it out before somebody could come in and squash it. But another point of the sanctions, Will, is just we have that great book, well, absolutely horrific book, Richard Nephew, his
Oh
version of
yeah.
Mein Kampf, essentially explaining how that U.S. sanctions are meant to torture and harm the poor civilians of countries.
Yeah.
That is their stated purpose. They may tell you differently. Rachel Maddow may tell you differently. Whoever you watch on the news will tell you. Sean Hannity will say it's about the Ayatollahs or whatever the hell. But it's really about making the people suffer, because they believe if you make the people suffer and poor and starving to death, then they'll rise up and kill their leaders. That's what they want.
Almost never happens ever. Pretty much just it's a war on civilians that doesn't the second part never happens.
All right. Well, so since I've just, really taken the show down a lot on the whole, terribleness road and the worst things going on in the U.S. empire, go ahead and talk about Yemen and just officially depress us all for the rest of the day.
Yeah, sure. You thought that was bad. Let me wait till you hear this. So yeah, back in February, you and I on this show, we gave quite a bit of coverage to Biden's announcement that the U.S. is going to stop supporting Saudi Arabia's offensive operations in Yemen. I think you and I were both fairly skeptical about that. Like, I know I wondered aloud on the show, like, are they going to keep doing a lot of the same stuff and just kind of like invent some argument that it's actually all defensive after all? That like, just sort of a semantics issue. Well, we have a report now in Vox last week that suggests that basically is happening. That like it's sort of to a limited degree, but they are kind of spinning offensive stuff as defensive. So while Biden did apparently stop some U.S. support, like logistics and intelligence support, and I know he did cancel a couple arms sales, specific ones, we are still helping the Saudis maintain their aircraft, which is, as I'll get to in a little bit here, that is an essential part of their war effort. It's even if it is kind of indirect. And these aren't actual Air Force mechanics doing the maintenance, but it's rather civilian contractors. But they are hired and contracted through a DoD like government process. And the Biden administration could at any time choose to scrap these contracts if it wanted to, but it is opting not to do that. And we even had the top Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, confirming all of this in a press briefing last week, where he's even acknowledging that, like, yes, this maintenance support could technically be used for both defensive and offensive operations. But he said that, there is an argument for that. But he said that we do it anyway because I actually have the quote right here. Quote, we have a military to military relationship with Saudi Arabia that is important to the region and to our interests, end quote. And so it always seems to come down to that with Saudi Arabia, that like we have a good racket going with them and we don't want to disturb that. And so we have to keep abetting their war crimes and all their horrible policies, that like we have no choice basically because our relationship is so important. And so even after Biden paid all this lip service to winding down our support for offensive operations, it turns out we basically are still supporting those. And it all comes back to, well, the Saudi-U.S. relationship is just so important. We have no choice. So we are kind of getting the same line that we always get when it comes to U.S. officials justifying the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And while some of this has been scaled back, like as I acknowledged, the arms sales and stuff have been scaled back, we are still co-signing this war like fully. I don't know exactly how accurate this figure is, but the Vox story cited this expert who said that without this maintenance support, Saudi could only fly 2 out of every 10 of its warplanes. And so that sounds to me like, we are enabling this war still, that if without us, it couldn't happen basically. And we are still the one making that happen. So, as good as it is that we're not doing these arms sales, that we stop the logistics support, like the USA is still enabling what is effectively a genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity in Yemen.
I see no difference between this and the decision that Trump made in 2018 to stop the mid-air refueling once the
Yeah, yeah,
Emiratis were able to provide that service. The Saudis are simply, a little bit better able after 5 years of bombing Yemen to be able to do it without the U.S. holding their hand the whole time. And so
yep.
now Biden's, they have supply chains for their weapons. The UK is guaranteeing that. And hell, Biden went back on, well, not go, but he only said he was freezing the arms sale to the UAE. And the one he said at the same time he was freezing the arms sale to Saudi Arabia. So I see no reason to suspect that he won't unfreeze arms sales to Saudi Arabia when it's a little bit more politically convenient for him. And well,
Yeah.
we have to remember that Biden's administration is loaded up with people who profit big off of Saudi Arabia. When you look at who buys the most U.S. weapons, it's the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia is usually one of the top countries on that list. And all the way up to the top, including Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, recently working at Raytheon. So,
That's right on their board, I think.
yep, yep.
Yeah.
And so many others work at think tanks that are funded by the arms manufacturers. And our previous secretaries of defense did too. Who
Like the last five or so, yeah.
yeah, it's not looking good. Will trying to end these wars when the Secretary of Defense has a financial incentive to keep them going. But
Yeah.
all right, that's all I have. That's enough bad news for today. You got
Yeah, I
anything
think so.
else?
No, okay. One last thing I'll say here is, I found it interesting this Vox article on this whole thing that the maintenance is continuing. It is otherwise a very good article. It's a great, good journalism, good reporting. But this journalist just is such so emblematic of the corporate press. At the very end of the story, they're like, well, maybe they're being very wishy-washy about it. Well, maybe we shouldn't end these contracts, these maintenance contracts to Saudi Arabia, because then how would they defend themselves against the Houthis, the vicious menace of the Houthis, without ever asking why do the Houthis attack Saudi Arabia? Is it perhaps are those their own defensive operations? Is that their own, or at least reprisals against Saudi aggression? But that question is never asked. It's just like, well, the Saudis have to be able to defend themselves, and it's a very similar kind of discourse to what it's said about Israel. That like it's just erase all context. Don't ask any questions about why there might be violence on one side or the other. It's just I don't know. I found it very emblematic of the mainstream reporting on Yemen, and it's very extra depressing, I guess.
Right, it's an insane standard too that we have to arm people so that they could defend them. Like we have a responsibility to make sure everybody on the planet has the ability to defend themselves.
Yeah.
It's a tyrannical dictatorship. Why should we help them defend themselves? I still don't understand why we help the Egyptians defend themselves. Do
Yeah.
we really want to be giving Al-Sisi $1 billion a year that he's going to use to repress his own people? I mean, it's crazy that's the thing. Also, if let's say I don't know if the military, control coup government of Myanmar started lobbing some rockets over the border against China. Are we going to start selling China Patriot missile batteries and saying, well, China has the right to defend themselves, so we have to sell obviously,
Right.
that's a stupid argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is all always very selective too of who they decide has the right to defend themselves and who doesn't. So,
Yeah, right. All right. Well, that's good for today. You're on Twitter at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anslone _. The show is at con _interest. We have Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash wallets in the show notes page. Please donate us some crypto. We also take fiat, Patreon, and Subscribestar are the best ways to do that. If you want to donate us money a different way, we will find a way to take that money. We're trying to do more on Odyssey. I did a live stream exclusive with Patrick McFarlane last week, so be sure to subscribe to our Odyssey channel. That way you could get maybe some little extra content that we decide to put out from time to time. And then I don't know what else can Facebook, MeWe, share the show, Libertarian Institute. That place is great. Thanks
Yeah.
everybody, and we'll be back with another show on Wednesday.
See you, everybody.